Chapter 4 of Anna of the Five Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 4. A visit. The special teachers' meeting to which Willy Price had referred was one of the final preliminaries to a revival, that is, a revival of godliness and Christian grace, about to be undertaken by the Wesleyan Methodist Society in Bursley. Its object was to arrange for a personal visitation of the parents of Sunday school scholars in their homes. Hitherto, Anna had felt but little interest in the revival. This had several times been brought indirectly before her notice, but she had regarded it as a phenomenon which recurred at intervals in the cycle of religious activity, and as not in any way affecting herself. The gradual centering of public interest, however, that mysterious movement which, defying analysis, gathers force as it proceeds, and ends by coercing the most indifferent, had already modified her attitude towards this forthcoming event. It got about that the preacher who had been engaged, a specialist in revivals, was a man of miraculous powers. The number of souls which he had snatched from eternal torment was precisely stated, and it amounted to tens of thousands. He played the cornet to the glory of God, and his cornet was of silver. His more distant past had been ineffably wicked, and the faint rumour of that dead wickedness clung to his name like a piquant odour. As Anna walked up Trafalgar Road from Price's, she observed that the hoardings had been billed with great posters announcing the revival and the revivalist, who was to commence his work on Friday night. During tea, Mr. Tellwright interrupted his perusal of the Evening Signal to give utterance to a rather remarkable speech. "Bless us," he said, "the old trumpeter'll turn the town upside down." "Do you mean the revivalist, father?" Anna asked. "Aye." "He's a beautiful man," Agnes exclaimed with enthusiasm. "Our teacher showed us his portrait after school this afternoon. I never saw such a beautiful man." The father gazed hard at the child for an instant, cap in hand, and then turned to Anna with a slightly sardonic air. "What are you doing in this revival, Anna?" "Nothing," she said, "only there's a teachers' meeting about it to-morrow night, and I have to go to that. Young Mr. Price mentioned it to me specially to-day." A pause followed. "Didst get anything out of Price?" Tellwright asked. "Yes, he gave me £10. He wants you to go and look over the works. Says they're falling to pieces." "Check, I reckon." She corrected the surmise. "Better give me them notes, Anna," he said after tea. "I'm going to the bank in the morning, and I'll pay 'em into your account." There was no reason why she should not have suggested the propriety of keeping at least one of the notes for her private use, but she dared not. She had never any money of her own, not a penny, and the effective possession of £5 seemed far too audacious a dream. She hesitated to imagine her father's reply to such a request, even to frame the request to herself. The thing, viewed close, was utterly impossible. And when she relinquished the notes, she also, without being asked, gave up her cheque-book, deposit-book, and pass-book. She did this while ardently desiring to refrain from doing it, as it were under the compulsion of an invincible instinct. Afterwards she felt more at ease, as though some disturbing question had been settled once and for all. During the whole of that evening she timorously expected Miners, saying to herself, however, that he certainly would not call before Thursday. On Tuesday evening she started early for the teachers' meeting. Her intention was to arrive among the first, and to choose a seat in obscurity, since she knew well that every eye would be upon her. She was divided between the desire to see Miners and the desire to avoid the ordeal of being seen by her colleagues in his presence. She trembled lest she should be incapable of commanding her mien so as to appear unconscious of this inspection by curious eyes. The meeting was held in a large classroom, furnished with wooden seats, a chair, and a small table. On the grey distempered walls hung a few biblical cartoons, depicting scenes in the life of Joseph and his brethren, but without reference to Potiphar's wife. From the whitewashed ceiling depended a T-shaped gas fitting, one burner of which showed a glimmer, though the sun had not yet set. The evening was oppressively warm, and through the wide open window came the faint effluvium of populous cottages, and the distant but raucous cries of children at play. When Anna entered, a group of young men were talking eagerly round the table. Among these was Willy Price, who greeted her. No others had come. She sat down in a corner by the door, invisible except from within the room. Gradually the place began to fill. Then at last Myners entered. Anna recognised his authoritative step before she saw him. He walked quickly to the chair in front of the table, and, including all in a friendly and generous smile, said that in the absence of Mr. Titus Price it fell to him to take the chair. He was glad that so many had made a point of being present. Everyone sat down. He gave out a hymn, and led the singing himself, attacking the first note with an assurance born of practice. Then he prayed, and as he prayed, Anna gazed at him intently. He was standing up, the ends of his fingers pressed against the top of the table. Very carefully dressed as usual, he wore a brilliant new red necktie and a gardenia in his buttonhole. He seemed happy, wholesome, earnest, and unaffected. He had the elasticity of youth with the firm wisdom of age, and it was as if he had never been younger and would never grow older, remaining always at just 30 and in his prime. Incomparable to the rest, he was clearly born to lead. He fulfilled his functions with tact, grace, and dignity. In such an affair as this present, he disclosed the attributes of the skilled workman, whose easy and exact movements are a joy and wonder to the beholder. And behind all was the man, his excellent and strong nature, his kindliness, his sincerity. Yes, to Anna, Myners was perfect that night. The reality of him exceeded her dreamy meditations. Fearful on the brink of an ecstatic bliss, she could scarcely believe that from the enticements of 1,000 women this paragon had been preserved for her. Like most of us, she lacked the high courage to grasp happiness boldly and without apprehension. She had not learnt that nothing is too good to be true. Myners' prayer was a cogent appeal for the success of the revival. He knew what he wanted, and confidently asked for it, approaching God with humility but with self-respect. The prayer was punctuated by amens from various parts of the room. The atmosphere became suddenly fervent, emotional, and devout. Here was a lofty endeavour, idealism, a burning spirituality, and not all the pettinesses unavoidable in such an organisation as a Sunday school could hide the difference between this impassioned altruism and the ignoble selfishness of the worldly. Anna felt, as she had often felt before, but more acutely now, that she existed only on the fringe of the Methodist society. She had not been converted. Technically, she was a lost creature. The converted knew it, and in some subtle way their bearing towards her and others in her case always showed that they knew it. Why did she teach? Not from the impulse of a religious zeal. Why was she allowed to have charge of a class of immortal souls? The blind could not lead the blind, nor the lost save the lost. These considerations troubled her. Conscience pricked, accusing her of a continual pretence. The rôle of professing Christian, through false shame, had seemed distasteful to her. She had said that she could never stand up and say, "I am for Christ," without being uncomfortable. But now she was ashamed of her inability to profess Christ. She could conceive herself proud and happy in the very part which formerly she had despised. It was these believers, workers, exhorters, wrestlers with Satan, who had the right to disdain, not she. At that moment, as if defining her thoughts, Myners prayed for those among them who were not converted. She blushed, and when the prayer was finished, she feared lest every eye might seek hers in inquiry. But no one seemed to notice her. Myners sat down, and seated, began to explain the arrangements for the revival. He made it plain that prayers without industry would not achieve success. His remarks revealed the fact that underneath the broad religious structure of the enterprise, and supporting it, there was a basis of individual diplomacy and solicitation. The town had been mapped out into districts, and each of these was being importuned as at an election. By the thoroughness and instancy of this canvass, quite as much as by the intensity of powerful desire, would Christ conquer. The affair was a campaign before it was a prostration at the throne of grace. He spoke of the children, saying that in connection with these, they, the teachers, had at once the highest privilege and the most sacred responsibility. He told of a special service for the children, and the need of visiting them in their homes, and inviting the parents also to this feast of God. He wished every teacher during to-morrow and the next day, and the next day, to go through the list of his or her scholars' names, and call, if possible, at every house. There must be no shirking. "Will you ladies do that?" he exclaimed with an appealing, serious smile. "Will you, Miss Dickinson? Will you, Miss Machin? Will you, Mrs. Salt? Will you, Miss Sutton? Will you?" Until at last it came, "Will you, Miss Tellwright?" "I will," she answered, with averted eyes. "Thank you. Thank you all." Some others spoke, hopefully, enthusiastically, and one or two prayed. Then Myners rose. "May the blessing of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost rest upon us now and for ever." "Amen," someone ejaculated. The meeting was over. Anna passed rapidly out of the door, down the quadrangle, and into Trafalgar Road. She was the first to leave, daring not to stay in the room a moment. She had seen him. He had not altered since Sunday. There was no disillusion, but a deepening of the original impression. Caught up by the soaring of his spirit, her spirit lifted, and she was conscious of vague but intense longing skyward. She could not reason or think in that dizzying hour, but she made resolutions which had no verbal form, yielding eagerly to his influence and his appeal. Not till she reached the bottom of Duck Bank, and was breasting the first rise towards Bleakridge, did her pace slacken. Then a voice called to her from behind. She recognised it, and turned sharply beneath the shock. Myners raised his hat and greeted her. "I'm coming to see your father," he said. "Yes," she said, and gave him her hand. "It was a very satisfactory meeting to-night," he began, and in a moment they were talking seriously of the revival. With the most oblique delicacy, the most perfect assumption of equality between them, he allowed her to perceive his genuine and profound anxiety for her spiritual welfare. The atmosphere of the meeting was still around him, the divine fire still uncooled. "I hope you will come to the first service on Friday night," he pleaded. "I must," she replied. "Oh yes, I shall come." "That's good," he said. "I particularly wanted your promise." They were at the door of the house. Agnes, obviously expectant and excited, answered the bell. With an effort, Anna and Myners passed into a lighter mood. "Father said you were coming, Mr. Myners," said Agnes. And, turning to Anna, "I've set supper all myself." "Have you?" Myners laughed. "Capital! You must let me give you a kiss for that." He bent down and kissed her, she holding up her face to his with no reluctance. Anna looked on, smiling. Mr. Tellwright sat near the window of the back parlour, reading the paper. Twilight was at hand. He lowered his head as Myners entered with Agnes in train, so as to see over his spectacles, which were halfway down his nose. "How d'ye do, Mr. Myners? I was just going to begin my supper. I don't wait, you know." And he glanced at the table. "Quite right," said Myners, "so long as you wouldn't eat it all." "Would he have eaten it all, Agnes, do you think?" Agnes pressed her head against Myners' arm and laughed shyly. The old man sardonically chuckled. Anna, who was still in the passage, wondered what could be on the table. If it was only the usual morsel of cheese, she felt that she should expire of mortification. She peeped. The cheese was at one end, and at the other a joint of beef, scarcely touched. "Nay, nay," said Tellwright, as if he had been engaged some seconds upon the joke. "I'd have saved you the bone." Anna went upstairs to take off her hat, and immediately Agnes flew after her. The child was breathless with news. "Oh, Anna, as soon as you'd gone out, father told me Mr. Mynors was coming for supper. Did you know before?" "Not till Mr. Mynors told me, dear." It was characteristic of her father to say nothing until the last moment. "Yes, and he told me to put an extra plate, and I asked him if I'd better put the beef on the table, and first he said no. Cross, you know. And then he said I could please myself, so I put it on. Why has Mr. Mynors come, Anna?" "How should I know? Some business between him and father, I expect." "It's very queer," said Agnes positively, with the child's aptitude for looking a fact squarely in the face. "Why queer?" "You know it is, Anna." She frowned, and then breaking into a joyous smile. "But isn't he nice? I think he's lovely." "Yes," Anna assented coldly. "But really?" Agnes persisted. Anna brushed her hair, and determined not to put on the apron which she usually wore in the house. "Am I tidy, Anna?" "Yes. Run downstairs now. I'm coming directly." "I want to wait for you." Agnes pouted. "Very well, dear." They entered the parlour together, and Henry Mynors jumped up from his chair and would not sit at table until they were seated. Then Mr. Tellwright carved the beef, giving each of them a very small piece, and taking only cheese for himself. Agnes handed the water jug and the bread. Mynors talked about nothing especial, but he talked and laughed the whole time. He even made the old man laugh by a comical phrase aimed at Agnes's mad passion for gillyflowers. He seemed not to have detected any shortcomings in the table appointments, the coarse cloth and plates, the chipped tumblers, the pewter cruet, and the stumpy knives, which caused anguish in the heart of the housewife. He might have sat at such a table every night of his life. "May I trouble you for a little more beef?" he asked presently, and Anna fancied a shade of mischief in his tone as he thus forced the old man into a tardy hospitality. "Thanks. And a morsel of fat?" She wondered whether he guessed that she was worth £50,000, and her father worth perhaps more. But on the whole Anna enjoyed the meal. She was sorry when they had finished, and Agnes had thanked God for the beef. It was not without considerable reluctance that she rose and left the side of the man whose arm she could have touched at any time during the previous 20 minutes. She had felt happy and perturbed in being so near to him, so intimate and free. Already she knew his face by heart. The two girls carried the plates and dishes into the kitchen, Agnes making the last journey with the tablecloth, which Mynors had assisted her to fold. "Shut the door, Agnes," said the old man, getting up to light the gas. It was an order of dismissal to both his daughters. "Let me light that," Mynors exclaimed, and the gas was lighted before Mr. Tellwright had struck a match. Mynors turned on the full force of gas. Then Mr. Tellwright carefully lowered it. The summer quarter's gas bill at that house did not exceed 5 shillings. Through the open windows of the kitchen and parlour, Anna could hear the voices of the two men in conversation. Mynors, vivacious and changeful; her father's monotonous, curt and heavy. Once she caught the old man's hard, dry chuckle. The washing up was done. Agnes had accomplished her home lessons. The grandfather's clock chimed the half-hour after 9. "You must go to bed, Agnes." "Mustn't I say good night to him?" "No, I will say good night for you." "Don't forget to. I shall ask in the morning." The regular sound of talk still came from the parlour. A full moon passed along the cloudless sky. By its light and that of a glimmer of gas, Anna sat cleaning silver, or rather nickel, at the kitchen table. The spoons and forks were already clean, but she felt compelled to busy herself with something. At length the talk stopped, and she heard the scraping of chair legs. Should she return to the parlour, or should she... Even while she hesitated, the kitchen door opened. "Excuse me coming in here," said Mynors. "I wanted to say good night to you." She sprang up, and he took her hand. Could he feel the agitation of that hand? "Good night." "Good night." He said it again. "And Agnes wished me to say good night to you for her." "Did she?" He smiled. Till then his face had been serious. "You won't forget Friday?" "As if I could," she murmured, after he had gone. End of chapter 4. Of Anna of the Five Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 5. The Revival. Anna spent the 2 following afternoons in visiting the houses of her school children. She had no talent for such work, which demands the vocal rather than the meditative temperament, and the apparent futility of her labours would have disgusted and disheartened her, had she not been sustained and urged forward by the still active influence of Mynors and the teachers' meeting. There were 15 names in her class book, and she went to each house, except 4 whose tenants were impeccable Wesleyan families, and would have considered themselves insulted by a quasi-didactic visit from an upstart like Anna. Of the 11, some parents were rude to her, others begged, and she had nothing to give. Others made perfunctory promises. Only 2 seemed to regard her as anything but a somewhat tiresome impertinence. The fault was doubtless her own. Nevertheless, she found joy in the uncongenial and ill-performed task, the cold, fierce joy of the nun in her penance. When it was done, she said, "I have done it," as one who had sworn to do it, come what might, yet without quite expecting to succeed. On the Friday afternoon, during tea, a boy brought up a large foolscap packet addressed to Mr. Tellwright. "From Mr. Mynors," the boy said. Tellwright opened it leisurely after the boy had gone, and took out some sheets covered with figures, which he carefully examined. "Anna," he said, as she was clearing away the tea things, "I understand thou'rt going to th' revival meeting to-night. I shall have a message as thou mun give to Mr. Mynors." When she went upstairs to dress, she saw the Suttons' landau standing outside their house on the opposite side of the road. Mrs. Sutton came down the front steps and got into the carriage, and was followed by a little restless, nervous, alert man, who carried in his hand a black case of peculiar form. "The revivalist!" Anna exclaimed, remembering that he was to stay with the Suttons during the revival week. Then this was the renowned crusader, and the case held his renowned cornet. The carriage drove off down Trafalgar Road, and Anna could see that the little man was talking vehemently and incessantly to Mrs. Sutton, who listened with evident interest. At the same time, the man's eyes were everywhere, absorbing all details of the street and houses with unquenchable curiosity. "What is the message for Mr. Mynors, father?" she asked in the parlour, putting on her cotton gloves. "Oh," he said, and then paused. "Shut the door, lass." She shut it, not knowing what this cautiousness foreshadowed. Agnes was in the kitchen. "It's a this'n," Tellwright began. "Young Mynors wants a partner wi' a couple of £1,000, and he come to me. You understand, 'tis what they call a sleeping partner he's after. He'll give a third share in his concern for £2,000 now. I've looked into it, and there's money in it. He's no fool, and he's gotten hold of a good thing. He sent me up his stock taking and balance sheet to-day, and I've been over the place mysen. I'm telling thee this, lass,
'cause I havena 2000 of my own idle just now, and I thought as thou might happen to like the investment."
"But, father—"
"Listen. I know as there's only 400 of thine in the bank now, but next week'll see the beginning of July, and dividends coming in. I've reckoned as you'll have nigh on 1400 i' dividends and interest, and I can lend you a couple of hundred in case of necessity. It's a rare chance. Thou'd best take it."
"Of course, if you think it's all right, father, that's enough," she said, without animation.
"I'm not telling thee I think it's all right," he remarked sharply. "You mun tell Miners as I say it's satisfactory. Tell him that, see. I say it's satisfactory. I shall want for to see him later on. He told me he couldna come up any night next week, so ask him to make it the week after. There's no hurry. Dunna forget."
What surprised Anna most in the affair was that Henry Mynors should have been able to tempt her father into a speculation. Ephraim Tellwright, the investor, was usually as shy as a well-fed trout, and this capture of him by a youngster only 2 years established in business might fairly be regarded as a prodigious feat. It was indeed the highest distinction of Mynors' commercial career. Henry was so prominently active in the Wesleyan Society that the members of that society, especially the women, were apt to ignore the other side of his individuality. They knew him supreme as a religious worker. They did not realise the likelihood of his becoming supreme in the staple manufacture. Left an orphan at 17, Mynors belonged to a family now otherwise extinct in the Five Towns. One of those families which, by virtue of numbers, variety, and personal force, seem to permeate a whole district, to be a calculable item of it, an essential part of its identity. The elders of the Mynors blood had once occupied the Red House opposite Tellwright's, now used as a school, and had there reared many children. The school building was still known as Mynors's by old-fashioned people. Then the parents died in middle age. One daughter married in the north, another in the south. A third went to China as a missionary and died of fever. The eldest son died. The second had vanished into Canada and was reported a scapegrace. The third was a sea captain. Henry, the youngest, alone was left. And of all the family, Henry was the only one to be connected with the earthenware trade. There was no inherited money, and during 10 years he had worked for a large firm in Turnhill, as clerk, as traveller, and last as manager, living always quietly in lodgings. In the fullness of time he gave notice to leave, was offered a partnership, and refused it. Taking a newly erected manufactory in Bursley, near the canal, he started in business for himself, and it became known that, at the age of 28, he had saved £1,500. Equally expert in the labyrinths of manufacture and in the niceties of the markets, he was reckoned a peerless traveller. Mynors inevitably flourished. His order books were filled and flowing over at remunerative prices, and insufficiency of capital was the sole peril to which he was exposed. By the raising of a finger he could have had a dozen working and moneyed partners, but he had no desire for a working partner. What he wanted was a capitalist who had confidence in him, Mynors. In Ephraim Tellwright he found the man. Whether it was by instinct, good luck, or skilful diplomacy that Mynors secured this invaluable prize, no one could positively say. And perhaps even he himself could not have catalogued all the obscure motives that had guided him to the shrewd miser of Manor Terrace. Anna had meant to reach chapel before the commencement of the meeting, but the interview with her father threw her late. As she entered the porch, an officer told her that the body of the chapel was quite full, and that she should go into the gallery, where a few seats were left near the choir. She obeyed. Pew holders had no rights at that service. The scene in the auditorium astonished her, effectually putting an end to the worldly preoccupation caused by her father's news. The historic chapel was crowded almost in every part, and the congregation, impressed, excited, eager,
sang the opening hymn with unprecedented vigour and sincerity. Above the rest could be heard the trained voices of a large choir, and even the choir, usually perfunctory, seemed to share the general fervour. In the vast mahogany pulpit, the Reverend Reginald Banks, the superintendent minister, a stout, pale-faced man with pendant cheeks and cold grey eyes, stood impassively regarding the assemblage, and by his side was the revivalist, a mannequin in comparison with his colleague. On the broad balustrade of the pulpit lay the cornet. The fiery and inquisitive eyes of the revivalist probed into the furthest corners of the chapel. Apparently no detail of any single face or of the florid decoration escaped him, and as Anna crept into a small empty pew next the east wall, she felt that she too had been separately observed. Mr. Banks gave out the last verse of the hymn, and simultaneously with the leading chord from the organ, the revivalist seized his cornet and joined the melody. Massive yet exultant, the tones rose clear over the mighty volume of vocal sound, an incitement to victorious effort. The effect was instant. An ecstatic tremor seemed to pass through the congregation, like wind through ripe corn, and at the close of the hymn it was not until the revivalist had put down his cornet that the people resumed their seats. Amid the frou-frou of dresses and subdued clearing of throats, Mr. Banks retired softly to the back of the pulpit, and the revivalist, mounting a stool, suddenly dominated the congregation. His glance swept masterfully across the chapel and round the gallery. He raised one hand with the stilling action of a mesmerist, and the people, either kneeling or inclined against the front of the pews, hid their faces from those eyes. It was as though the man had in a moment measured their iniquities, and had courageously resolved to intercede for them with God, but was not very sanguine as to the result. Every one, except the organist, who was searching his tune-book for the next tune, seemed to feel humbled, bitterly ashamed, as it were, caught in the act of sin. There was a solemn and terrible pause. Then the revivalist began. "Behold us, O dread God, suppliants for thy mercy." His voice was rich and full, but at the same time sharp and decisive. The burning eyes were shut tight, and Anna, who had a profile view of his face, saw that every muscle of it was drawn tense. The man possessed an extraordinary histrionic gift, and he used it with imagination. He had two audiences, God and the congregation. God was not more distant from him than the congregation, or less real to him, or less a heart to be influenced. Declamatory and full of effects carefully calculated, a work of art, in fact, his appeal showed no error of discretion in its approach to the eternal. There was no minimizing of committed sin, nor yet an insincere and grovelling self-accusation. A tyrant could not have taken offence at its tone, which seemed to pacify God, while rendering the human audience still more contrite. The conclusion of the catalogue of wickedness and swift confident turn to Christ's cross was marvellously impressive. The congregation burst out into sighs, groans, blessings, and amens, and the pillars of distant rural conventicles, who had travelled from the confines of the circuit to its centre in order to partake of this spiritual excitation, began to feel that they would not be disappointed. "Let the Holy Ghost descend upon us now," the revivalist pleaded with restrained passion, and then, opening his eyes and looking at the clock in front of the gallery, he repeated, "Now, now, at 21 minutes past 7. Then his eyes, without shifting, seemed to ignore the clock, to gaze through it into some unworldly dimension, and he murmured in a soft, dramatic whisper, "I see the divine dove." The doors, closed during prayer, were opened, and more people entered. A youth came into Anna's pew. The superintendent minister gave out another hymn, and when this was finished, the revivalist, who had been resting in a chair, came forward again. "Friends and fellow sinners," he said, "a lot of you, fools that you are, have come here tonight to hear me play my cornet. Well, you have heard me, I have played the cornet, and I will play it again. I would play it on my head, if by so doing I could bring sinners to Christ. I have been called a mountebank. I am one. I glory in it. I am God's mountebank, doing God's precious business in my own way. But God's precious business cannot be carried on, even by a mountebank, without money, and there will be a collection towards the expenses of the revival. During the collection we will sing Rock of Ages, and you shall hear my cornet again. If you feel willing to give us your sixpences, give. But if you resent a collection," here he adopted a tone of ferocious sarcasm, "keep your miserable sixpences, and get 6 pennyworth of miserable enjoyment out of them elsewhere." As the meeting proceeded, submitting itself more and more to the imperious hypnotism of the revivalist, Anna gradually became oppressed by a vague sensation, which was partly sorrow and partly an inexplicable dull anger at her own penitence. She felt as if everything was wrong and could never by any possibility be righted. After 2 exhortations from the minister and the revivalist, and another hymn, the revivalist once more prayed, and as he did so, Anna looked stealthily about in a sick, preoccupied way. The youth at her side stared glumly in front of him, and as he did so, Anna looked stealthily about in a sick, preoccupied way. The youth at her side stared glumly in front of him. In the orchestra, Henry Myners was whispering to the organist. Down in the body of the chapel, the atmosphere was electric, perilous, overcharged with spiritual emotion. She was glad she was not down there. The voice of the revivalist ceased, but he kept the attitude of supplication. Sobs were heard in various quarters, and here and there an elder of the chapel could be seen talking quietly to some convicted sinner. The revivalist began softly to sing "Jesu, lover of my soul," and most of the congregation, standing up, joined him. But the sinners, stricken of the spirit, remained abjectly bent, tortured by conscience, pulled this way by Christ and that by Satan. A few rose and went to the communion rails, there to kneel in the sight of all. Mr. Banks descended from the pulpit, and opening the wicket which led to the communion table, spoke to these over the rails, reassuringly, as a nurse to a child. Other sinners, desirous of fuller and more intimate guidance, passed down the aisles, and so into the preacher's vestry at the eastern end of the chapel, and were followed thither by class leaders and other proved servants of God. Among these last were Titus Price and Mr. Sutton. "The blood of Christ atones," said the revivalist solemnly at the end of the hymn. "The Spirit of Christ is working among us. Let us engage in private prayer. Let us drive the devil out of this chapel." More sighs and groans followed. Then someone cried out in sharp, shrill tones, "Praise him!" and another cried, "Praise him!" and an old woman's quavering voice sang the words, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." Anna was in despair at her own predicament, and the sense of sin was not more strong than the sense of being confused and publicly shamed. A man opened the pew door, and sitting down by the youth's side, began to talk with him. It was Henry Myners. Anna looked steadily away at the wall, fearful lest he should address her too. Presently the youth got up with a frenzied gesture and walked out of the gallery, followed by Myners. In a moment she saw the youth stepping awkwardly along the aisle beneath, towards the inquiry room, his head forward, and the lower lip hanging as though he were sulky. Anna was now in the profoundest misery. The weight of her sins, of her ingratitude to God, lay on her like a physical and intolerable load, and she lost all feeling of shame, as a seasick voyager loses shame after an hour of nausea. She knew then that she could no longer go on living as aforetime. She shuddered at the thought of her tremendous responsibility to Agnes, who took her for perfection. She recollected all her sins individually, lies, sloth, envy, vanity,
even theft in her infancy. She heaped up all the wickedness of a lifetime, hysterically augmented it, and found a horrid pleasure in the exaggeration. Her virtuous acts shrank into nothingness. A man, and then another, emerged from the vestry door with beaming, happy face. These were saved. They had yielded to Christ's persuasive invitation. Anna tried to imagine herself converted, or in the process of being converted. She could not. She could only sit, moveless, dull and abject. She did not stir, even when the congregation rose for another hymn. In what did conversion consist? Was it to say the words, "I believe"? She repeated to herself softly, "I believe, I believe." But nothing happened. Of course she believed. She had never doubted or dreamt of doubting that Jesus died on the cross to save her soul, from eternal damnation. She was probably unaware that any person in Christendom had doubted that fact so fundamental to her. What then was lacking? What was belief? What was faith? A venerable class leader came from the vestry, and slowly climbing the pulpit stairs, whispered in the ear of the revivalist. The latter faced the congregation with a cry of joy. "Lord," he exclaimed, "we bless thee that 17 souls have found thee. Lord, let the full crop be gathered, for the fields are white unto harvest." There was an exuberant chorus of praise to God. The door of the pew was opened gently, and Anna started to see Mrs. Sutton at her side. She at once guessed that Myners had sent to her this angel of consolation. "Are you near the light, dear Anna?" Mrs. Sutton began. Anna searched for an answer. She now sat huddled up in the corner of the pew, her face partially turned towards Mrs. Sutton, who looked mildly into her eyes. "I don't know," Anna stammered, feeling like a naughty schoolgirl. A doubt whether the whole affair was not, after all, absurd, flashed through her, and was gone. "But it is quite simple," said Mrs. Sutton. "I cannot tell you anything you do not know. Cast out pride. Cast out pride. That is it. Nothing but earthly pride prevents you from realizing the saving power of Christ. You're afraid, Anna, afraid to be humble. Be brave. It is so simple, so easy, if one will but submit." Anna said nothing, had nothing to say, was conscious of nothing save excessive discomfort. "Where do you feel your difficulty to be?" asked Mrs. Sutton. "I don't know," she answered, wearily. "The happiness that awaits you is unspeakable. I have followed Christ for nearly 50 years, and my happiness increases daily. Sometimes I do not know how to contain it all. It surges above all the trials and disappointments of this world. Oh, Anna, if you will but believe." The ageing woman's thin, distinguished face, crowned with abundant grey hair, glistened with love and compassion, and as Anna's eyes rested upon it, Anna felt that here was something tangible, something to lay hold on. "I think I do believe," she said weakly. "You think? Are you sure? Are you not deceiving yourself? Belief is not with the lips, it is with the heart." There was a pause. Mr. Banks could be heard praying. "I will go home," Anna whispered at length, "and think it out for myself." "Do, my dear girl, and God will help you." Mrs. Sutton bent and kissed Anna affectionately, and then hurried away to offer her ministrations elsewhere. As Anna left the chapel, she encountered the chapel keeper, pacing regularly to and fro across the length of the broad steps. In the porch was a notice that cabinet photographs of the revivalist could be purchased on application at 1 shilling each. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Anna of the Five Towns. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. Anna of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 6. Willy. Anna closed the bedroom door softly. Through the open window came the tones of Caldon church clock, famous for their sonority and richness, announcing 11. Agnes lay asleep under the blue and white counterpane, on the side of the bed next the wall, the bedclothes pushed down and disclosing the upper half of her nightgowned figure. She slept in absolute repose, with flushed cheek and every muscle lax, her hair by some chance drawn in a perfect straight line diagonally across the pillow. Anna glanced at her sister, the image of physical innocence and childish security, and then, depositing the candle, went to the window and looked out. The bedroom was over the kitchen and faced south. The moon was hidden by clouds, but clear stretches of sky showed thick-studded clusters of stars brightly winking. To the far right, across the fields, the silhouette of Hillport Church could just be discerned on the ridge. In front, several miles away, the blast furnaces of Caldon Bar ironworks shot up vast wreaths of yellow flame, with canopies of tinted smoke. Still more distant were 1,000 other lights, crowning chimney and kiln, and nearer, on the wastelands west of Bleakridge, long fields of burning ironstone glowed with all the strange colours of decadence. The entire landscape was illuminated and transformed by these unique pyrotechnics of labour atoning for its grime, and dull weird sounds, as of the breathings and sighings of a giant nocturnal creature, filled the enchanted air. It was a romantic scene, a romantic summer night, balmy, delicate, and wrapped in meditation. But Anna saw nothing there save the repulsive evidences of manufacture, and had never seen anything else. She was still horribly, acutely miserable, exhausted by the fruitless search for some solution of the enigma of sin, her sin in particular, and of redemption. She had cogitated in a vain circle until she was no longer capable of reasoned ideas. She gazed at the stars and into the illimitable spaces beyond them, and thought of life and its inconceivable littleness, as millions had done before, in the presence of that same firmament. Then, after a time, her brain resumed its nightmare-like task. She began to probe herself anew. Would it have availed if she had walked publicly to the penitential form at the communion rail, and, ranging herself with the working men and women, proved by that overt deed the sincerity of her contrition? She wished ardently that she had done so, yet knew well that such an act would always be impossible for her, even though the evasion of it meant eternal torture. Undoubtedly, as Mrs. Sutton had implied, she was proud, stiff-necked, obstinate in iniquity. Agnes stirred slightly in her sleep, and Anna, aroused, dropped the blind, turned towards the room, and began to undress, slowly, with reflective pauses. Her melancholy became grim, sardonic. If she was doomed to destruction, so let it be. Suddenly, half glad, she knelt down and prayed that pride might be cast out, burying her face in the coverlet, and caging the passionate effusion in a whisper, lest Agnes should be disturbed. Having prayed, she still knelt quiescent. Her eyes were dry and burning. The last car thundered up the road, shaking the house, and she rose, finished undressing, blew out the candle, and slipped into bed by Agnes's side. She could not sleep, did not attempt to sleep, but abandoned herself meekly to despair. Her thoughts covered again the interminable round, and again and yet again. In the twilight of the brief summer night her accustomed eyes could distinguish every object in the room, all the bits of furniture which had been brought from Hanbridge, and with which she had been familiar since her memory began. Everything appeared mean, despicable, cheerless. There was nothing to inspire. She dreamt impossibly of a high spirituality which should metamorphose all, change her life, lend glamour to the most pitiful surroundings, ennoble the most ignominious burdens, a spirituality never to be hers. At any rate, she would tell her father in the morning that she was convicted of sin, and, however hopelessly, seeking salvation. She would tell both her father and Agnes at breakfast. The task would be difficult, but she swore to do it. She resolved. She endeavoured to sleep, and did sleep uneasily for a short period. When she woke, the great business of the dawn had begun. She left the bed, and, drawing up the blind, looked forth. The furnace fires were palling. A few milky clouds sailed in the vast pallid blue. It was cold just then, and she shivered. She went to the glass and examined her face carefully, but it gave no signs whatever of the inward warfare. She saw her plain and mended nightgown. Suppose she were married to Myners? Suppose he lay asleep in the bed where Agnes lay asleep? Involuntarily she glanced at Agnes, to certify that the child, and none else, was indeed there, and got into bed hurriedly and hid herself, because she was ashamed to have had such a fancy. But she continued to think of Myners. She envied him for his cheerfulness, his joy, his goodness, his dignity, his tact, his sex. She envied every man. Even in the sphere of religion, men were not fettered like women. No man, she thought, would acquiesce in the futility to which she was already half resigned. A man would either wring salvation from the heavenly powers, or race gloriously to hell. Myners was a god. She recollected her resolution to speak to her father and Agnes at breakfast, and shudderingly confirmed it, but less stoutly than before. Then an announcement made by Mr. Banks in chapel on the previous evening presented itself, as though she was listening to it for the first time. It was the announcement of a prayer meeting for workers in the revival, to be held that Saturday morning at 7 o'clock. She instantly decided to go to the meeting, and the decision seemed to give her new hope. Perhaps there she might find peace. On that faint expectancy she fell asleep again, and did not wake till 6:30, after her usual hour. She heard noises in the yard. It was her father going towards the garden with a wheelbarrow. She dressed quickly, and when she had pinned on her hat, she woke Agnes. "Going out, Cis?" the child asked sleepily, seeing her attire. "Yes, dear. I'm going to the 7 o'clock prayer meeting, and you must get breakfast. You can, can't you?" The child assented, glad of the chance. "But what are you going to the prayer meeting for?" Anna hesitated. Why not confess? No. "I must go," she said quietly at length. "I shall be back before 8. "Does father know?" Agnes inquired apprehensively. "No, dear." Anna shut the door quickly, went softly downstairs and along the passage, and crept into the street like a thief. Men and women and boys were on their way to work, with hurried clattering steps, some munching thick pieces of bread as they went, all self-centred, apparently morose and not quite awake. The dust lay thick in the arid gutters, and in drifts across the pavement, as the night wind had blown it. Vehicular traffic had not begun, and blinds were still drawn, and though the footpaths were busy, the street had a deserted and forlorn aspect. Anna walked hastily down the road, avoiding the glances of such as looked at her, but peering furtively at the faces of those who ignored her. All seemed callous, hoggishly careless of the everlasting verities. At first it appeared strange to her that the potent revival in the Wesleyan chapel had produced no effect on these preoccupied people. Bursley, then, continued its dull and even course. She wondered whether any of them guessed that she was going to the prayer meeting, and secretly sneered at her therefor. When she had climbed Duck Bank, she found to her surprise that the doors of the chapel were fast closed, though it was 10 minutes past 7. Was there to be no prayer meeting? A momentary sensation of relief flashed through her, and then she saw that the gate of the schoolyard was open. She should have known that early morning prayers were never offered up in the chapel, but in the lecture hall. She crossed the quadrangle with beating heart, feeling now that she had embarked on a frightful enterprise. The door of the lecture hall was ajar. She pushed it and went in. At the other end of the hall a meagre handful of worshippers were collected, and on the raised platform stood Mr. Banks, vapid, perfunctory, and fatigued. He gave out a verse, and pitched the tune too high, but the singers, with a heroic effort, accomplished the verse without breaking down. The singing was thin and feeble, and the eagerness of one or two voices seemed strained, as though with a determination to make the best of things. Mynors was not present, and Anna did not know whether to be sorry or glad at this. She recognised that, save herself, all present were old believers, tried warriors of the Lord. There was only one other woman, Miss Sarah Vawdrey, an aged spinster, who kept house for Titus Price and his son, and found her sole diversion in the variety of her religious experiences. Before the hymn was finished, a young man joined the assembly. It was the youth who had sat near Anna on the previous night. An ecstatic and naïve bliss shone from his face. In his prayer, the minister drew the attention of the deity to the fact that, although a score or more of souls had been ingathered at the first service, the Methodists of Bursley were by no means satisfied. They wanted more. They wanted the whole of Bursley, and they would be content with no less. He begged that their earnest work might not be shamed before the world by partial success. In conclusion, he sought the blessing of God on the revivalist, and asked that this tireless enthusiast might be led to husband his strength, at which there was a fervent Amen. Several men prayed, and a pause ensued, all still kneeling. Then the minister said, in a tone of oily politeness, "Will a sister pray?" Another pause followed. "Sister Tellwright?" Anna would have welcomed death and damnation. She clasped her hands tightly, and longed for the endless moment to pass. At last Sarah Vawdrey gave a preliminary cough. Miss Vawdrey was always happy to pray aloud, and her invocations usually began with the same phrase: "Lord, we thank thee that this day finds us with our bodies out of the grave and our souls out of hell." Afterwards the minister gave out another hymn, and as soon as the singing commenced, Anna slipped away. Once in the yard, she breathed a sigh of relief. Peace at the prayer meeting! It was like coming out of prison. Peace was farther off than ever. Nay, she had actually forgotten her soul in the sensations of shame and discomfort. She had contrived only to make herself ridiculous, and perhaps the pious at their breakfast tables would discuss her and her father and their money and the queer life they led. If Mynors had been but present! She walked out into the street. It was 20 minutes to 8 by the town hall clock. The last workman's car of the morning was just leaving Bursley. It was packed inside and outside, and the conductor hung insecurely on the step. At the gates of the manufactory opposite the chapel, a man in a white smock stood placidly smoking a pipe. A prayer meeting was a little thing, a trifle in the immense and regular activity of the town. This thought necessarily occurred to Anna. She hurried homewards, wondering what her father would say about that morning's unusual excursion. A couple of 100 yards distant from home, she saw to her astonishment Agnes emerging from the front door of the house. The child ran rapidly down the street, not observing Anna till they were close upon each other. "Oh, Anna, you forgot to buy the bacon yesterday. There isn't a scrap. And father's fearfully angry. He gave me sixpence, and I'm going down to Leal's to get some as quick as ever I can." It was a thunderbolt to Anna, this seemingly petty misadventure. As she entered the house she felt a tear on her cheek. She was ashamed to weep, but she wept. This, after the fiasco of the prayer meeting, was a climax of woe. It overtapped and extinguished all the rest. Her soul was nothing to her now. She quickly took off her hat and ran to the kitchen. Agnes had put the breakfast things on the tray ready for setting. The bread was cut, the coffee portioned into the jug, the fire burned bright, and the kettle sang. Anna took the cloth from the drawer in the oak dresser and went to the parlour to lay the table. Mr. Tellwright was at the end of the garden, pointing the wall, his back to the house. The table set, Anna observed that the room was only partly dusted. There was a duster on the mantelpiece. She seized it to finish, and at that moment the kitchen clock struck 8. Simultaneously Mr. Tellwright dropped his trowel and came towards the house. She doggedly dusted one chair, and then, turning coward, flew away upstairs. The kitchen was barred to her, since her father would enter by the kitchen door. She had forgotten to buy bacon, and breakfast would be late. It was a calamity unique in her experience. She stood at the door of her bedroom, and waited vehemently for Agnes's return. At last the child raced breathlessly in. Anna flew to meet her. With incredible speed the bacon was whipped out of its wrapper, and Anna picked up the knife. At the first stroke she cut herself, and Agnes was obliged to bind the finger with rag. The clock struck the half hour like a knell. It was 20 minutes to 9, 40 minutes behind time, when the two girls hurried into the parlour, Anna bearing the bacon and hot plates, Agnes the bread and coffee. Mr. Tellwright sat upright and ferocious in his chair, the image of offence and wrath. Instead of reading his letters, he had fed full of this ineffable grievance. The meal began in a desolating silence. The male creature's terrible displeasure permeated the whole room like an ether, invisible, but carrying vibrations to the heart. Then, when he had eaten one piece of bacon and cut his envelopes, the miser began to empty himself of some of his anger in stormy tones that might have uprooted trees. Anna ought to feel thoroughly ashamed. He could not imagine what she had been thinking of. Why didn't she tell him she was going to the prayer meeting? Why did she go to the prayer meeting, disarranging the whole household? How came she to forget the bacon? It was gross carelessness. A pretty example to her little sister. The fact was that since her birthday she had gotten above herself. She was careless and extravagant. Look how thick the bacon was cut. He should not stand it much longer. And her finger all red, and the blood dropping on the cloth. A nice sight at a meal. Go and tie it up again. Without a word, she left the room to obey. Of course she had no defence. Agnes, her tears falling, pecked her food timidly like a bird, not daring to stir from her chair, even to assist at the finger. "What did Manners say?" Tellwright inquired fiercely, when Anna had come back into the room. "Mr. Myners," she murmured, at a loss, but vaguely apprehending further trouble. "Did you see him?" "Yes, father." "Did you give him my message?" "I forgot it." God in heaven, she had forgotten the message. With a devastating grunt, Mr. Tellwright walked speechless out of the room. The girls cleared the table, exchanging sympathy with a single mute glance. Anna's one satisfaction was that, even if she had remembered the message, she could not possibly have delivered it. Ephraim Tellwright stayed in the front parlour till 10:30 o'clock, unseen but felt, like an angry god behind a cloud. The consciousness that he was there, unappeased and dangerous, remained uppermost in the minds of the two girls during the morning. At 10:30 he opened the door. "Agnes!" he commanded, and Agnes ran to him from the kitchen with the speed of propitiation. "Yes, father." "Take this note down to Price's, and don't wait for an answer." "Yes, father." She was back in 20 minutes. Anna was sweeping the lobby. "If Mr. Myners calls while I'm out, you mun tell him to wait," Mr. Tellwright said to Agnes, pointedly ignoring Anna's presence. Then, having brushed his greenish hat on his sleeve, he went off towards town to buy meat and vegetables. He always did Saturday's marketing himself. At the butcher's and in the St. Luke's covered market he was a familiar and redoubtable figure. Among the salespeople who stood the market was a wrinkled, hardy old potato woman from the other side of Moorthorne. Every Saturday the miser bested her in their higgling match, and nearly every Saturday she scornfully threw at him the same joke. "Get thee along to the post office, Mr. Terrick. Happen they'll give you 3 penn'orth of stamps for 5pence halfpenny." He seldom failed to laugh heartily at this. At dinner the girls could perceive that the shadow of his displeasure had slightly lifted, though he kept a frowning silence. Expert in all the symptoms of his moods, they knew that in a few hours he would begin to talk again, at first in monosyllables, and then in short detached sentences. An intimation of relief diffused itself through the house like a hint of spring in February. These domestic upheavals followed always the same course, and Anna had learnt to suffer the later stages of them with calmness and even with impassivity. Henry Mynors had not called. She supposed that her father had expected him to call for the answer which she had forgotten to give him, and she had a hope that he would come in the afternoon. Once again she had the idea that something definite and satisfactory might result if she could only see him, that she might, as it were, gather inspiration from the mere sight of his face. After dinner, while the girls were washing the dinner things in the scullery, Agnes's quick ear caught the sound of voices in the parlour. They listened. Mynors had come. Mr. Tellwright must have seen him from the front window, and opened the door to him before he could ring. "It's him," said Agnes, excited. "Who?" Anna asked self-consciously. "Mr. Mynors, of course," said the child sharply, making it quite plain that this affectation could not impose on her for a single instant. "Anna!" It was Mr. Tellwright's summons through the parlour window. She dried her hands, doffed her apron, and went to the parlour, animated by 1,000 fears and expectations. Why was she to be included in the colloquy? Mynors rose at her entrance, and greeted her with conspicuous deference, a deference which made her feel ashamed. "Oh," the old man growled, but he was obviously content. "I gave Anna a message for you yesterday, Mr. Mynors, but her forgot to deliver it, wench like. You might have been saved the trouble of calling. Now, as you're here, I've summat to tell you. It'll be Anna's money as'll go into that concern of yours. I've none by me. In fact, I'm almost fast for brass. But her'll have near 2000, as makes no matter in a month's time. And her says her'll go in wi' you on strength of my recommendation." This speech was evidently a perfect surprise for Henry Mynors. For a moment he seemed to be at a loss. Then his face gave candid expression to a feeling of intense pleasure. "You know all about this business, then, Miss Tellwright?" She blushed. "Father has told me something about it." "And are you willing to be my partner?" "Nay, I didna say that," Tellwright interrupted. "It'll be Anna's money, but i' my name." "I see," said Mynors gravely. "But if it is Miss Anna's money, why should not she be the partner?" He offered one of his courtly diplomatic smiles. "Oh, but " Anna began in deprecation. Tellwright laughed. "Ay," he said, "why not? It'll be experience for the lass." "Just so," said Mynors. Anna stood silent, like a child who is being talked about. There was a pause. "Would you care for that arrangement, Miss Tellwright?" "Oh, yes," she said. "I shall try to justify your confidence. I needn't say that I think you and your father will have no reason to be disappointed. £2000 is, of course, only a trifle to you, but it is a great deal to me, and—" He hesitated. Anna did not surmise that he was too much moved by the sight of her and the situation to continue, but this was the fact. "There's nobbut one point, Mr. Mynors," Tellwright said bluntly, "and that's the interest on the capital, as must be deducted before reckoning profits. Us must have 6%. "But I thought we had settled it at 5," said Mynors with sudden firmness. "When settled as you shall have 5 on your 1500," the miser replied with imperturbable audacity, "but us mun have our 6. "I certainly thought we had thrashed that out fully, and agreed that the interest should be the same on each side." Mynors was alert and defensive. "Nay, young man, us mun have our 6. We're taking a risk." Mynors pressed his lips together. He was taken at a disadvantage. Mr. Tellwright, with unscrupulous cleverness, had utilised the effect on Mynors of his daughter's presence to regain a position from which the younger man had definitely ousted him a few days before. Mynors was annoyed, but he gave no sign of his annoyance. "Very well," he said at length, with a private smile at Anna, to indicate that it was out of regard for her that he yielded. Mr. Tellwright made no pretence of concealing his satisfaction. He, too, smiled at Anna, sardonically. The last vestige of the morning's irritation vanished in a glow of triumph. "I'm afraid I must go," said Mynors, looking at his watch. "There is a service at chapel at 3. Our revivalist came down with Mrs. Sutton to look over the works this morning, and I told him I should be at the service, so I must. You coming, Mr. Tellwright?" "Nay, my lad, I'm old enough to leave it to young uns." Anna forced her courage to the verge of rashness, moved by a swift impulse. "Will you wait 1 minute?" she said to Myners. "I'm going to the service. If I'm late back, father, Agnes will see to the tea. Don't wait for me." She looked him straight in the face. It was one of the bravest acts of her life. After the episode of breakfast, to suggest a procedure which might entail any risk upon another meal was absolutely heroic. Tellwright glanced away from his daughter and at Myners. Anna hurried upstairs. "Who's thy lawyer, Mr. Myners?" Tellwright asked. "Dane," said Myners. "That'll be convenient. Dane does my bit of business too. I'll see him and make a bargain wi' him for t' partnership deed. He always works by contract for me. I've no patience with 6 and 8pences." Myners assented. "You must come down some afternoon and look over the works," he said to Anna, as they were walking down Trafalgar Road towards chapel. "I should like to," Anna replied. "I've never been over a works in my life." "No? You're going to be a partner in the best works of its size in Bursley," Myners said enthusiastically. "I'm glad of that," she smiled, "for I do believe I own the worst." "What, prices, do you mean?" She nodded. "Ah!" he exclaimed, and seemed to be thinking. "I wasn't sure whether that belonged to you or your father. I'm afraid it isn't quite the best of properties, but perhaps I'd better say nothing about that. We had a grand meeting last night. Our little cornet player quite lived up to his reputation, don't you think?" "Quite," she said faintly. "You enjoyed the meeting?" "No," she blurted out, dismayed but resolute to be honest. There was a silence. "But you were at the early prayer meeting this morning, I hear." She said nothing while they took a dozen paces, and then murmured, "Yes." Their eyes met for a second, hers full of trouble. "Perhaps," he said at length, "perhaps, excuse me saying this, but you may be expecting too much." "Well?" she encouraged him, prepared now to finish what had begun. "I mean," he said earnestly, "that we cannot promise you any sudden change of feeling, any sudden relief and certainty such as some people experience. At least I never had it. What is called conversion can happen in various ways. It is a question of living, of constant endeavour, with the example of Christ always before us. It need not always be a sudden wrench, you know, from the world. Perhaps you have been expecting too much," he repeated, as though offering balm with that phrase. She thanked him sincerely, but not with her lips, only with the heart. He had revealed to her an avenue of release from a situation which had seemed on all sides fatally closed. She sprang eagerly towards it. She realised afresh how frightful was the dilemma from which there was now a hope of escape, and she was grateful accordingly. Before, she had not dared steadily to face its terrors. She wondered that even her father's displeasure or the project of the partnership had been able to divert her from the plight of her soul. Putting these mundane things firmly behind her, she concentrated the activities of her brain on that idea of Christ-like living, day by day, hour by hour, of a gradual aspiration towards Christ, and thereby an ultimate arrival at the state of being saved. This, she thought, she might accomplish. This gave opportunity of immediate effort, dispensing with the necessity of an impossible, violent, spiritual metamorphosis. They did not speak again until they had reached the gates of the chapel, when Myners, who had to enter the choir from the back, bade her a quiet adieu. Anna enjoyed the service, which passed smoothly and uneventfully. At a revival, night is the time of ecstasy and fervour and salvation. In the afternoon one must be content with preparatory praise and prayer. That evening, while father and daughters sat in the parlour after supper, there was a ring at the door. Agnes ran to open, and found Willy Price. It had begun to rain, and the visitor, his jacket collar turned up, was wet and draggled. Agnes left him on the mat and ran back to the parlour.
Young Mr. Price wants to see you, father." Tellwright motioned to her to shut the door. "You'd best see him, Anna," he said. "It's none of my business." "But what has he come about, father?" "That note as I sent down this morning. I told old Titus as he mun pay us £20 on Monday morning certain, or us should distrain. Them as can pay £10, especially in bank notes, can pay £20 and 30.
"And suppose he says he can't?"
"Tell him he must. I've figured it out, and changed my mind about that works. Old Titus isn't done for yet, though he's getting on that road. Us can screw another 50 out of him. That'll only leave 6 months' rent owing. Then us can turn him out. He'll go bankrupt. Us can claim for our rent afore th' other creditors, and us'll have 100 or 120 in hand towards doing th' old place up a bit for a new tenant." "Make him bankrupt, father!" Anna exclaimed. It was the only part of the ingenious scheme which she had understood. "Ay," he said laconically.
"But would Christ have driven Titus Price into the bankruptcy court?"
"If he pays, well and good."
"Hadn't you better see Mr. William, father?"
"Whose property is it, mine or thine?" Tellwright growled.
His good humour was still precarious, insecurely re-established, and Anna obediently left the room. After all, she said to herself, a debt is a debt, and honest people pay what they owe. It was in an uncomplacent tone that Anna invited Willy Price to the front parlour. Nervousness always made her seem harsh, and moreover she had not the trick of hiding firmness under suavity. "Will you come this way, Mr. Price?" "Yes," he said, with ingratiating, eager compliance. Dusk was falling, and the room in shadow. She forgot to ask him to take a chair, so they both stood up during the interview. "A grand meeting we had last night," he began, twisting his hat. "I saw you there, Miss Tellwright." "Yes." "Yes, there was a splendid muster of teachers. I wanted to be at the prayer meeting this morning, but couldn't get away. Did you happen to go, Miss Tellwright?" She saw that he knew she had been present, and gave him another curt monosyllable. She would have liked to be kind to him, to reassure him, to make him happy and comfortable, so ludicrous and touching were his efforts after a social urbanity which should appease. But, just as much as he, she was unskilled in the subtle art of converse. "Yes," he continued, "and I was anxious to be at tonight's meeting, but the dad asked me to come up here. Said I'd better." That term, "the dad," uttered in William's slow, drawling voice, seemed to show Titus Price in a new light to Anna, as a human creature loved, not as a mere gross physical organism. The effect was quite surprising. William went on. "Can I see your father, Miss Tellwright?" "Is it about the rent?" "Yes," he said. "Well, if you will tell me." "Oh, I beg pardon," he said quickly. "Of course I know it's your property, but I thought Mr. Tellwright always saw after it for you. It was he that wrote the letter this morning, wasn't it?" "Yes," Anna replied. She did not explain the situation. "You insist on another £20 on Monday?" "Yes," she said. "We paid 10 last Monday." "But there is still over 100 owing." "I know, but Miss Tellwright, you mustn't be hard on us. Trade's bad." "It says in the Signal that trade is improving," she interrupted sharply. "Does it?" he said. "But look at prices. They're cut till there's no profit left. I assure you, Miss Tellwright, my father and me are having a hard struggle. Everything's against us, and the works in particular, as you know." His tone was so earnest, so pathetic, that tears of compassion almost rose to her eyes as she looked at those simple, naive blue eyes of his. His lanky figure and clumsily fitting clothes, his feeble placatory smile, the twitching movements of his long red hands, all contributed to the effect of his defencelessness. She thought of the text, "Blessed are the meek," and saw in a flash the deep truth of it. Here was she and her father, rich, powerful, autocratic, and there were Willy Price and his father, commercial hares, hunted by hounds of creditors, hares that turned in plaintive appeal to those greedy jaws for mercy, and yet she, a hound, envied at that moment the hares. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the failures, blessed are the stupid, For they, unknown to themselves, have a grace which is denied to the haughty, the successful, and the wise. The very repulsiveness of old Titus, his underhand methods, his insincerities, only served to increase her sympathy for the pair. How could Titus help being himself, any more than Henry Mynors could help being himself? And that idea led her to think of the prospective partnership, destined by every favourable sign to brilliant success, and to contrast it with the ignoble and forlorn undertaking in Edward Street. She tried to discover some method of soothing the young man's fears, of being considerate to him without injuring her father's scheme. "If you will pay what you owe," she said, "we will spend it all, every penny, on improving the works." "Miss Tellwright," he answered, with fatal emphasis, "we cannot pay." Ah, she wished to follow Christ day by day, hour by hour, constantly to endeavour after saintliness. But what was she to do now? Left to herself, she might have said, in a burst of impulsive generosity, "I forgive you all arrears. Start afresh." But her father had to be reckoned with. "How much do you think you can pay on Monday?" she asked coldly. At that moment her father entered the room. His first act was to light the gas. Willy Price's eyes blinked at the glare, as though he were trembling before the anticipated decree of this implacable old man. Anna's heart beat with sympathetic apprehension. Tellwright shook hands grimly with the youth, who restated hurriedly what he had said to Anna. "It's all this'n," the old man began with finality, and stopped. Anna caught a glance from him dismissing her. She went out in silence. On the Monday, Titus Price paid another £20. End of Chapter 6.